Hello everyone, this is Brian Ka with another video. So we're going to continue from the previous video and do another Remedies essay question today. So today we're going to do question 6 from July 2013. Without further ado, let's try to get this done and outline it as fast as we can. Because as you know, we get, I think, an hour to do each of these essays. So I think that realistically speaking, because I outline every single one of these questions, I don't think I want to spend more than 20 minutes outlining. But at the same time, for me at least, I have to read sometimes these questions 2 to 3 times, maybe more, to get my head around it. So I think that in the end, if you can outline it, and even if it takes 2 or 3 readings to completely outline, I think that would be ideal. So here, July 2013, question 6. The call of the question here says, what intentional tort claims can Paul reasonably bring against Doug, and what remedies can he reasonably seek? So, as you know, a lot of these questions are hybrid, and it looks like this question is a hybrid of torts and remedies. So, let's erase this board. Okay, so this is a torts slash remedies hybrid, right? So what happened here? Before we read into the facts, let's think about the call of the question one more time, which is, what tort claims can Paul bring against Doug? Okay, so we have a good idea of what they're looking for, what the subject matter this is, and now we can read the facts and try to figure out what we need to do. So let's see. Paul owns a 50-acre lot in the country. Doug owns a smaller, unimproved lot to the north. Okay. It helps me sometimes to draw a small diagram. So this is Paul. This is Paul's 50-acre, right? And Doug owns a smaller, unimproved lot to the north. So I guess Doug owns another lot up here somewhere, but we have to see what they're saying. A stream runs through Paul's lot near the boundary line with Doug's lot. Okay, so I guess there's a stream maybe here. Let's Paul. I guess this is like a stream. And let's see. the boundary line with Doug's lot. So I guess Doug is like maybe here. That's Doug. Okay. Paul has a house at the south end of his lot. South end, maybe here. There's a home. And uses for summer vacations. He plans to build a larger house in the future. Okay. So we didn't miss anything. Doug is here. Paul is here. 50 acres. Doesn't indicate how many acres Doug possesses, so we don't know that. But we do know that this is 50 acres. So Doug began to clear his land to build a house. To do so, he had to fell trees and haul them to a nearby lumber mill. He asked Paul if he could take a shortcut across Paul's lot to the mill, and Paul agreed. Okay, so I'm thinking maybe the mill was here. And instead of going here like that, I guess he asked for permission to cut across maybe from here to here, or maybe here to here. But either way, um, he had to cut across Paul's lot in order to get to the mill, right? And he agreed. He agreed. Paul agreed. So, first trip, Duck dumped the trees on Paul's lot near the stream. So I guess Doug, you know, what did he do? He dumped the trees on Paul's lot. So he dumped the trees. Let's get rid of this. These are trees. You see, these are trees. And he dumped them here. And it was in a wooded area. Paul was unlikely to see, much less use. Several of the trees rolled into the stream, blocking its natural flow. So it blocked right here. Okay. So Paul left for the winter. As a result of the winter's normal rainfall, the stream overflowed, causing water to rush down Paul's house at the other end of the lot, flooding his garage and damaging a 3-year-old motorcycle. Okay. So I guess Paul had a garage here, garage, and he had a motorcycle, 3-year-old. Three, what does a motorcycle look like? Harley. Okay. So let's just make sure we get that. Garage and motorcycle, right? So water went into the garage, damages motorcycle. Okay. Paul comes back in the winter and learn what happened. It will cost $30,000 to remove trees. So, and trees' presence on the lot has depressed its market value from 50,000 to 40,000. So, 30,000 in trees. We have 10,000 went down market value. As for the motorcycle, 5,000 to repair, 4,000 to buy. Okay, so that's not bad. It's not so complicated because you know, we understand now what's really going on. Um, we know the damages that Paul suffered. We know that this is going to be torts. And basically, we're going to have to talk about what damages, if any. So, first, I would uh, outline my essay like this. So, here, okay, let's come back here. So, the, the torts I see here are number one, trespass to land. This is not really a nuisance issue. Nuisance is more like a unreasonable and substantial deprivation to one's enjoyment of their land, right? But here we have an intentional trespass or invasion of another person's land without consent. That's what a trespass is. When it comes to intent for trespass, one does not need to have the intent to trespass as long as they have the intent to um, step on another person's land. Meaning, let me say this again: the person trespassing doesn't have to have the intent or know that the land that they're trespassing is another person's land. They just have to have the intent to basically walk or trespass or intentionally invade another person's property. So here we already talked about, because this is an intentional tort, uh, obviously you're going to need intent, invasion of another person's property without. Okay, so I would flesh that out because this is asking what intentional claims. They even tell you what intentional tort. So we know we're not going to talk about negligence. Obviously, nothing like product liability. There's no product here. We're not going to talk about contracts. Obviously, this is not a contractual issue. They're asking you, hey, what intentional tort can you sue uh, Doug under if you're representing Paul? So, using the facts, you know, was there intent? You know, he doesn't have to be aware that the land that he's trespassing uh, is another person's land as long as he intended to trespass, right? So he dumped the trees on Paul's lot near the stream. In a wooded area Paul was unlikely to see. The fact that Um, it was wooded area, a place where Paul was unlikely to see smells or reeks of, you know, something not quite right, correct? So that kind of reveals his intent that, while Paul was not aware of this issue, he just wanted to use his land. Um, was there an invasion? Yes, there was an invasion because that wasn't his land. Although he had permission or license, which we can talk about later after we flush this out, um, it exceeded the scope because here the license was about taking a shortcut to get to the mill. There are no mentions of using the land for transportation. This looks like the scope of the license was basically just to cross from Doug's land to the mill to probably save time and money, right? Probably to save time. It wasn't to transport all these things to Paul's land. So we kind of briefly talked about license here. But going back to proving whether there was a trespass to land, um, now we're at another person's property. It's clear that Doug, used this part of Paul's land, not Doug's land. So, that's number three. That's another person's property. That proves number three. Now, I guess four is something that could be argued on both sides, and that's where I would bring the license issue, saying, "Hey, uh, there was no consent." Doug will say, "Yes, there was consent, but because a license to use another person's land is limited to the scope of the license, which was to take a shortcut to the mill, not to transport across a bunch of stuff or leave things here." The end result of this battle of whether there was a license or not, or whether there was consent or not, will probably favor uh, Paul, and that's how I would argue it, and I would definitely mention this sub issue, license issue, and this number four element without consent. So the conclusion would be, yes, this okay, this okay, this okay, this we're gonna argue back and forth, but in the end, because it exceeded the scope of the license, I would argue that Doug, liable for trespass, right? The second thing that we're gonna have to talk about is conversion slash trespass to chattel. Why? It's because the facts tell you it costs 5,000 to repair. That's more of a trespass to chattel issue because that's not a substantial deprivation of another person's property. Whereas conversion, you basically owe the entire amount at the place at the time that this conversion happened, which is $4,000 to buy. So because this $5,000 repair exceeds the cost of the motorcycle, I would argue that conversion has a stronger argument, but that's after we have to talk about remedies for number one, trespass to land, right? So when we talk about remedies, let's move this um, conversion. Trespass to chattel. Okay. So the first thing we talk about for trespass to land, I get a feeling that I would talk about um, compensatory and the elements for that, um, causation, foreseeability, which is basically under causation. Um, Certainty and mitigation. Now, for causation, we have actual cause, which is but for, and proximate cause, which is the foreseeability issue. So, but for Doug, placing all these trees on Paul's land and stopping the flow of this water, the garage would not have been damaged and the motorcycle wouldn't have been damaged. I would flesh that out because we're not talking about um, just garage and motorcycle. And also importantly, I would talk about the cost of removal of trees, obviously. But for Doug putting these trees and blocking this flow, Paul wouldn't have to move all these trees that Doug placed, which will cost $30,000, right? Also, if you want to argue for the diminution in value for the land, but for Doug placing all these trees here, blocking the flow, Paul wouldn't have suffered $10,000 in decrease in value of his land, right? So I would talk about but for. I would talk about all those three things: garage, motorcycle. Actually, this is first because this is most important. $30,000 in trees, or $10,000 in decrease in value, or garage or motorcycle. I will talk about all those threes under but for. Under foreseeability, is it foreseeable that when you place these trees blocking the flow, that the water will rise to the level of destroying, his land? Is it foreseeable that doing that will place all these trees so that Paul will have to pay $30,000 out of his pocket in order to remove them? Yes. Is it foreseeable that putting those trees, may clog up this water, so Paul would have to pay for a brand new garage? The argument is strong. Another one is motorcycle. Another foreseeability issue: is it foreseeable that doing all this, putting all these trees blocking the flow, will, damage his property on his land? And yes, because, it's foreseeable. I guess if you want to make a counter argument, you can say something like, the garage, it was his fault that it was placed so close to the water stream. I guess I could write that as a counter argument. The motorcycle should have been kept, somewhere here in a place that's waterproof, but that's, a little bit going overboard. And the court will likely side with Paul, saying that was a foreseeable result. So here we just did but for. Another one we did foreseeability. So we already did two tests. The third one is it certain that we have to go through the certainty element. Is it certain that doing this, putting all these trees, will make the water flow and damage all these things here? Yes, that's not an arguable issue. And lastly, did uh, did Paul mitigate the damages? Well, here what we get is, I think uh, Paul went, Paul left for the winter, and because of the rainfall, while he left, this happened. And I guess the argument that Doug could make is you shouldn't have left. That's a long shot, but that's what it is. You shouldn't have left. You know, you should have guarded your house, make sure this thing is not overflowing. So you failed to mitigate. Paul will argue that, hey, I did mitigate. You know, this is a trip that he takes every year, and before the trip, there were no issues because of these trees. It caused the water to overflow when it rained, and he did everything he could. He was just not around. You know, I mean, the law will not stop him from, leaving. He'll go wherever he wants. So this mitigation issue will probably not be difficult for Paul. So here, the now that we can prove compensatory damages, now we're gonna have to go back to this issue because we have $30,000 to remove the trees, $10,000 uh, that he lost because of decrease in value in his land. Now, will the court likely award 30,000 plus 10,000? This was a concept that I wasn't really good at, but usually for the purposes of law school exams or the bar, it is unlikely that the court will allow double recovery, meaning $30,000 to remove the trees plus decrease in value. Most likely, he'll have to choose to get either 30,000 or 10,000. I would mention the court will probably not allow double recovery. As a result, he's going to have to choose between, removing the trees or decrease in value. Here, I would argue Doug will say that he shouldn't have to remove all those trees. $10,000 in decreased value should be sufficient. That would be um, Doug's argument. But I would say, hey, the court will probably allow that Paul get 30,000, even though they're not going to allow double recovery under this and this. But they'll probably say, okay, you get $30,000 to remove the trees because that makes plaintiff whole. Now, if there are like other like incidentals, costs associated with removing the trees, I guess we can talk about that, or foresee or consequential damages, but the facts don't really have that. So I would just leave it here, and maybe you can talk about incidentals if you want. You know, as for restitution, I guess if you want to talk about whether no, there's no restitution here. That was the trees. If he had any monetary gain for leaving the trees here, because let's say renting a garage to store those trees would have cost him $10,000 a month, and by doing this, he was unjustly enriched. And I guess that's another thing that I guess you can mention. But the main thing here is compensatory damages, $30,000 over $10,000 that he lost as from his property value, right? Okay, so another thing that I would talk about on the remedies here would be um, injunction, because because first of all, there are three types of injunctions, right? We have TRO, temporary restraining order, which is something that plaintiff argues, prior to the start of a trial, uh, because if there is a the plaintiff will argue, my client, the plaintiff, will suffer irreparable harm as a result of not getting an injunction until the trial date, then they may ask for a TRO. And until the decision is made, you can also argue for preliminary injunction. Um, that's when the uh, that's has very similar elements to uh, temporary restraining order, except that um, for preliminary injunction, you have to let the other party know. You have to notify the other party. It cannot be done ex parte. That's the biggest difference. And you have to have the balance of equities, balance of interests, and show that for TRO, after balancing the equities, it strongly favors the plaintiff to win, and that's how you get a TRO. But you don't need to notify the other party. Here, you do need to notify the other party. Now, in this situation, are we looking for a temporary restraining order? Not really, because there's no, like, although this problem is, it's not a small problem, and it's you know time is an important issue, because if he doesn't take care of this, maybe his entire 50 acres will be damaged. But I think here we're looking at more of a um, injunction uh, to remove the trees, and that would be an equitable remedy, and that's given if there is inadequate legal damages. Um, we're gonna have to look at balancing, make sure that there are no defenses. I think there's like one more thing that I can't really recall right now, but the main thing is that injunction is granted if there's inadequate legal damages, right? And I would flush this out with the facts that are given here. Inadequate legal damages. Cost to remove the trees, 30,000, $10,000 decrease in value. So this is eh, um, because either way, um, injunction, maybe Doug will prefer injunction because maybe he can save some money, cut the costs of, removing the trees to maybe 20,000 if he hired his friend or something like that. So maybe, Doug will argue that balancing does favor whatever, there are no adequate defenses, and that there is no inadequate legal damages, but it'll probably fail because legal damages in 30,000, 10,000, $5,000 in garage and motorcycle are available, right? So I would talk about that. Um, do we talk about specific performance? No, because the first element for a specific performance is that there has to be a contract between both parties. Here, there's no contract. License, for the purposes of this question, I don't think would be considered a contract here. I guess that's arguable. But that was just a permission to use his land for walking, not to store land here. So I don't think that would uh, be a good argument for Doug. But anyhow, that's what injunction and compensatory damages. I think that's good for question, the first part of the question, which was to talk about um, legal damages and so forth, right? We also talked a little bit about uh, unjust enrichment here. If storing trees here, as a result, Doug was unjustly enriched, then under the theory of restitution, I guess you can argue for, like, if it was $10,000 he saved as a result of doing this, then I guess he can argue under the restitution theory, right? So we did talk about uh, injunction. Now we just have to talk about $5,000 to repair and $4,000 to buy. Uh, okay, so as we discussed earlier, because they're asking what theories can you use, conversion and trespass to chattel, right? And you're going to have to talk about the elements because they're asking you, you know, what intentional claims. And these are both intentional torts. Conversion is an intentional tort. Uh, Trespass to chattel is an intentional tort. It's just the difference in degree, meaning under conversion, you basically owe the fair market value of what the plaintiff lost at the time and place this conversion happened, right? So under conversion, the cost to buy a motorcycle is 4,000. Whereas for trespass to chattel, it's the cost of repair, right? But repair is 5,000, right? If you're, let's say, Doug, and you're liable for either conversion or trespass, even though conversion is the one in which you have to pay the entire amount of the property, whereas trespass to chattel, you only pay for repair. In this unique circumstance, because cost to repair exceeded the cost to buy by $1,000, this means that the defendant, Doug, will probably prefer to buy at $4,000 rather than pay $5,000 because that's saving $1,000, right? So I will talk about that. And other than that, I mean, because they're asking for intentional tort, there are what? How many are there? I don't know exactly. I don't count them. But if you want to talk about IIED, intentional infliction of emotional distress, I guess you can. But it's got to be an outrageous act, right? As you know, um, I guess I can briefly touch upon that. Um, Here, I guess, harmful or offensive touching with another person's body, meaning it doesn't have to be uh, your body, uh, even though I just said body. Uh, if something is connected to your body and it's harmed by offensive or harmful touching, then the plaintiff, I mean the defendant, will be liable. Here, we didn't really see that happen. So this question, I think that's it, because it was asking us for what intentional torts. We answered it. Trespass to land. We flushed it out. Uh, but then we got into legal damages portion. We talked about compensatory damages. We flushed it out. Causation, foreseeability, certainty, mitigation, and then we got to this point where um, because plaintiff can't get double recovery, he can't do both 30,000 and 10,000 most likely. So um, you know this will be arguable, and I would argue it for both sides. But you have to conclude. You can conclude that the court will probably side with Doug and give him 10,000. That doesn't matter as long as you conclude, right? But I would, it's most likely that because to make uh, Paul whole, from the damages that he suffered, $30,000 to remove the trees will definitely make him whole, and hopefully, restore his decrease in value by $10,000, and maybe restore that back to its original price. So that we already did. We also talked about uh, TRO and preliminary injunction, which didn't apply here, but we did talk about an injunction where if there's inadequate illegal remedies, then, and balancing, if it favors the plaintiff, they would have an argument for this. But, we said that, the legal damages are already here. We flushed it out. So even though we know what an injunction is, we talk about it, every element, we flush it out. I would conclude saying that because, there is adequate legal damages up there, court will probably not award an injunction, but rather uh, award legal damages, because courts always prefer to award legal damages over um, equitable remedies. Um, After that, uh, we had to obviously talk about two more torts: conversion and trespass to chattel, because there was an issue of $5,000 to repair versus $4,000 to buy. And because the cost to repair was $5,000, $10,000 more than the cost to buy, it would have benefited the defendant if he were just to buy, because that would save him $10,000. I mean, $1,000. And then in the end, if you wanted to talk about IIED, intentional infliction of emotional distress, I guess you could, but don't talk about negligence, because the call of the question asked you specifically what are the intentional torts. They didn't ask for negligence. So that about wraps up this essay, and I hope that people who are still struggling with remedies can watch this video and gain a lot of value and get help. For me, I think I've done this essay question 3 times, maybe twice, but this is like now this is like my third time. Prior to this, I think I went through it at least 2 or 3 times. So this is not something that's gonna just suddenly come at you. You're gonna have to just keep practicing, keep doing it over and over again until it becomes a second nature thing. So it just, you can just flush it out without much stress. So the point is, you have to, practice makes perfect. You have to keep doing it. Um, After you do it, if you forgot something, go back and redo it. I think that's the only way that you can improve on these essays. So with that, thanks for watching this video, and I'll talk to you next time.